Hello everyone, I'm Colonel Ray Beery, U.S. Air Force retired, speaking to you from my home in Lansdowne, Virginia. And I'm here today to give you some of my memories about something that took place in 1975 in Florida. It was one of the best experiences of my Air Force career, even though it only lasted for 100 days. I'm speaking of the Vietnam Refugee Center that was established as a tent city at Eglin Air Force Base, Fort Walton Beach, Florida. I want to go into detail about that, and my interviewer is here to present a few questions, and I'll discuss them now for a few minutes so that you can have a personal view on that event.
Tell us your rank, title in the U.S. military in 1975, and when did you receive notification that you were to be in charge of this Vietnamese refugee camp at Eglin Air Force Base?
Okay, here's the background of what happened in 1975. I was serving as a colonel on the headquarters of United States Air Force in the Pentagon. Vietnam fell in that month of April 1975, and a great number of refugees tried to leave the country, many of them successful. I had been to Vietnam. I had my tour of duty in Vietnam in 1969 and 70. But my story of my Vietnam experiences began a year before that, when I attended one of the Air Force military schools in Alabama, the Air Command and Staff College. About 400 mid-level Air Force officers received that training, and among my classmates were 6 members of the Vietnamese Air Force. 2 of them became pretty good friends with me and my family, and so when I went to Vietnam in 1969, I looked them up. 2 of them I was able to find, and as a matter of fact, one was right at the same air base where I was, Bien Hoa. Well, that was my experience in Vietnam. And then we go forward to 1975 in the Pentagon, when the president asked the military services to establish refugee centers to receive these Vietnamese refugees who were coming by boat and by airlift to Guam, to the Philippines, to California, and across the United States. The Air Force volunteered a location at the Eglin base, which was a huge piece of property, still is, 50 miles by 25 miles. It had several small airstrips. One of those airstrips had been used as a refugee center some years before to receive Cuban refugees. Now it was to be set up for the Vietnamese refugees. The Chief of Staff of the Air Force needed someone with some Vietnam experience to go down and command the group of Air Force people who were going to receive those refugees. My record showed that not only had I been to Vietnam, but I had studied the language a little, and I also had used my squadron in Vietnam in some civic action work. On the side, after we completed our regular duties, I took my men and sergeants and we built a school, a middle school for the Vietnamese kids in a nearby off-base village. That was a wonderful experience in and of itself, but that was on my record, and I'm sure that's why I was selected and sent down to Eglin to take command of that group. It was called a task force of about 1,000 Air Force people swept in from all across the Air Force, many bases, to come down there for the summer of 1975.
How did you begin to organize all of this, or were you told specifically to administer what was planned? Describe your job and its challenges.
I did not get there at the opening moments of the Eglin Refugee Center. It was established by request of headquarters and under the control of the commander at Eglin, who was a two-star general, Howard Lane. He immediately used his resources to obtain personnel tents, 6-man tents that could be set up at bare bases. And so General Lane had contracts out to the local community, and they brought in all kinds of workers and spent, as he told me later, $1 million a day for 10 days to establish the camp and get it ready to open. So I arrived 2 or 3 days after it was open and was placed in the command structure at that time.
You began in one location and moved to another. Was this in the plan, or did you adapt because of the influx of over 10,000 refugees?
I'm not able to talk about any other location. I'm still trying to do my research and find out if there was an initial location before we went to the one that existed throughout the summer. It was called Eglin Auxiliary Field Number 2, also called Pierce Field. So that's the only one I can personally talk to. As to the number of refugees, we were asked to provide a capacity for 10,000 refugees, and we did indeed have enough residential tents to handle that amount, that number. Of course, along with that, we had a lot of special tents to take care of the mess halls, the clinic, the processing center, etc. As to my headquarters, it was one of those double-wide trailer mobile home arrangements, very comfortable for me, I must say. But I was out among the refugees in the tent city a lot, of course, that summer.
Can you describe the 3 phases? Phase 1, the buildup, Phase 2, the pipeline, and Phase 3, the phase down.
Yes, that was the general plan indeed, to operate in phases. The buildup consisted of the physical structure of the tents, and then the personnel activity of sending orders out, requests for volunteers across the Air Force bases of the continental United States to get volunteers to agree to come, just as I did, on temporary duty and be part of that task force. There were 1,000 of us in that task force, and the volunteers were ready to go. They were eager to do their utmost to help these unfortunate folks who were fleeing their country to come in and live in America. Phase 2 was the pipeline. In only a very few days, the first airliner arrived at the main strip at Eglin, and here came the refugees. The camp was ready to receive them. They were put on buses, sent the 8 or 10 miles out to our tent city, and received at the reception center, where they were logged in, given an ID card, given a chance to clean up, and then given cots in the various tents. So the trickle began in Phase 2, and then every day more airliners would come, more refugees, and it wasn't very long until we had a population of 2,000 or 3,000 refugees. That grew over the time of the pipeline to a maximum of 6,000, and by the time the camp closed in September of 1975, we had logged in 11,000 refugees processing through.
How did the process work? Was there an initial processing center and then a decision about placement in one of the tent locations? Did you keep families together? And roughly how many tents were set up as living quarters?
Okay, on that point, The real work of the Refugee Center was to achieve the placement of the refugees and the sponsorship of them in locations all across the United States. Our national policy was to place the refugees across the country rather than in any few specific locations. And so the State Department was given the responsibility of processing and relocating the refugees. A very competent ambassador-level State Department official named Jim Chapman came to us at Eglin, and he had his crew of civil servants and volunteers from organizations like the Red Cross and Catholic World Services. The Lutheran service group was also a strong player at that time. As far as the statistics of the camp, I really don't have a good recollection or any records of that. We had enough of those tents to take care of everyone. We never had an overflow. A more interesting feature, of course, was how did we place family groups in those tents? As I said earlier, a tent had a capacity of 16 airmen. Well, now we had family groups. So as you can imagine, we got tarpaulins and were able to restrict certain areas, these tents, so that family groups could stay together. I want to add at this point, so that I don't forget it, that we also had children who came unaccompanied, which was difficult for them, very difficult to have left their parents and come to this country without an adult. So we had a number of people led by folks like the Wives Club groups from Eglin Air Force Base who gave those unaccompanied kids special attention. And they were looked after pretty well, I must say. I know they were unhappy, but they were able not only to interact with their American helpers, but the other Vietnamese families, mainly the mothers in that group, gave their care to the little unaccompanied kids.
Can you describe the camp at Site C3? Were there places for groups to eat? And you mentioned the recreation already, but also receive medical attention, eat medical attention, C3?
Okay, I'll take that question in reverse. Medical attention, of course, was available. We had a clinic, and we had doctors and nurses from the base hospital at Eglin out there full time to take care of any medical problems. In my recollection, there were no really serious medical problems. We did have 2 or 3, don't have the records, 2 or 3 older refugees did die that summer, very sadly. On the brighter side, of course, we had a marriage or two among the refugee group. The next thing to address about the public community was the dining arrangements. The Air Force set up field dining halls, just as we would do if we were deployed to bear bases around the world. Well, we started serving American-style meals to the refugees. And this didn't go over too well, so we did the right thing. We asked those Vietnamese wives who were good cooks if they would just kind of take over the food service operation, and as soon as we were providing choy yo rolls and pho soup, things went better in the dining halls. Lots of rice.
How were the refugees selected to leave Vietnam and come to the United States and this particular location that was one of the 3 camps in the United States?
Now that's a very interesting question. There was no selection about picking people to leave. It was run away the best you can, get there the best you can. I think most of our viewers will remember seeing pictures of a helicopter on a rooftop that sad day in April when the last refugees were going up the ladder and clambering up and getting in the helicopters. They were not selected. They just crowded in, and the survival of the fittest, the stronger pushed away the weaker, sad to say. So there wasn't much selection, and we who were receiving the refugees took what we got. Now, the story was much different after the refugee centers were in operation, and we were trying successfully to resettle them. That was a process handled in good order by the State Department folks. They would receive from volunteer places around the country notices. For example, this is the Presbyterian Church in Hays, Kansas. Our town can handle 12 refugees. They were ready to do that and sponsor them. That message came in and was put with thousands of others. And then the officials in charge of resettlement would look at the refugee records. Okay, here's a family of 4, mom, dad, and 2 kids. We're going to send them to Hays, Kansas. And that was okay with the refugees. That was okay with the people in Hays. And the first thing you know, that family group's on an airplane headed for the airport in Salina and bussed on over to Hays. That happened all across the country, and the typical stay at the camp for a refugee group, if it was a family group, was something like 3 to 4 weeks. You're in, you're out, and now that's the end of the activity as far as our task force was concerned. We had a much bigger problem with single men and unaccompanied children. Single men were sought after by commercial activities. Farmers would want some farm help, and they would request sponsorship. Factories, fisheries would ask for these single men. And that happened pretty well, and the placement again did not take too long. The unaccompanied children, however, were a major challenge. There, we had to find resettlement volunteers who were willing to take in these kids as if they would do in a foster family situation. I have a personal contact in that group. Let me tell you about a refugee who came to my camp in the middle of our pipeline with her. She was a toddler of 2 years of age. She had with her an older brother of 7 years of age. These 2 kids from the same family had 2 older teenage cousins. That was the group. So for resettlement, we took this young brother and sister and found a sponsor organization nearby in Pensacola, Florida. So the little girl who was born south of Saigon as Phan Kim Phuong was picked up by a foster mother and father in Pensacola and given a new name. She was now Kim McNulty, and she didn't speak a word of Vietnamese. Her older brother was with her. I don't have a lot of detail about him, but Kim is most important to me. I did not know her at that time when she was 2. I knew about that kind of situation. Fast forward many years to 4 years ago, when here I am in retirement, and I am contacted by a woman named Kim Delavette. She was that 2-year-old refugee. At this time, 4 years ago, she's trying to put together her heritage, her personal heritage. She's done her research, and she found out that I had been the commander there. Kim came to visit me here in Virginia and we hit it off. We've been great friends ever since. Kim was raised, as she put it, in a typical American family, elementary school, high school. She was adopted by her foster parents, and her name then was Kim McNulty. She went to work after college at Southwest Airlines in an office job, and she retired from that very good employment later on. Along the way, she married her high school boyfriend, Peter Delavette. But before they were married, she told him she wanted to trace her heritage back in Vietnam. So Peter and Kim went to Vietnam about 15 years ago looking for her heritage. They knew the village that she had grown up in. And by the way, let me mention what happened to her mother. Kim's mother was supposed to be on the same airplane that had Kim and Lam. But at the last moment, she went back to her apartment in Saigon to pick up something, and she missed the plane. Sadly, Kim learned later, her mother became a refugee in Thailand and died there. Now, we're back on that trip that Kim and her boyfriend took, backpacking from Hanoi all the way down to the Delta. Kim and Peter were walking the streets of their village, and they were recognized by a neighbor of the family, and who then introduced them to a man who turned out to be Kim's uncle. So that was a family reunion, a major event in Kim's life. She's been back several times. She's in contact with her relatives back in that village. Kim will be at a reunion of the refugees from the Eglin Center in May of 2025. And I know that some of you watching are going to attend that reunion. I just want to say at this moment that my health condition doesn't allow me to make that trip much as I would like. So I want to wish all of you well and congratulate you on what you have done, former refugees who have made a good life, a new life here in America over the last 50 years.
What was your goal for these new arrivals? Was there a requirement to learn enough English before leaving to be relocated?
Okay, that's a particular question. The last part of the question, no, they were not required to learn English, but they were all eager to do so. And right from the beginning, we did offer classes at the camp in English as a second language. And of course, once these refugees were placed and sponsored around the country, it obviously was essential for them to continue learning English. And most of them did very well. Some of the older refugees in a family group setting never did learn much English. It wasn't necessary for them. But those who were in the working world and in schools, they had to do it. And most of them picked up on it very well.
How did you find places for relocations, or was it someone else's job?
The someone else, to repeat myself, was the State Department, and they did a very good job. Just a word about the structure there. Gerald Ford was the president, and interestingly, he picked a very senior official from the State Department, a woman whose name is Julia Taft, from that famous political family out in Ohio, the Taft family. President William Howard Taft, Senator Robert Taft. Well, Julia Taft was given the responsibility to handle the refugee influx across the country. And I didn't mention it before, but of course there were other centers The Marine Corps had received refugees at Camp Pendleton in San Diego. And the Army received refugees at Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, and Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. So the refugees were coming through all these locations, greater numbers in the other centers than ours.
What were the biggest successes of the project?
The biggest success, of course, is as an operation, a national operation of receiving these refugees. Over the summer of 1975, the total influx was about 150,000. That wasn't the end of the Vietnamese refugees to America. In the following 10 to 15 years, we received more and more boat people who were able to escape from communist Vietnam. And the total number of refugees grew to nearly 2 million today from that exodus from Vietnam.
What were some of the challenges?
The challenges were about the same as you can think of a scouting summer camp across the country. Most people remember what it was like as a teenager to go to summer camp someplace in your scouting group. Well, the challenges were very simple. You met new friends. You lived in rather primitive conditions. You had special activities of the summer camp, recreation and eating and meetings and learning. Those were our challenges, but we met them. The way we organized our task force to handle that situation was to organize our population of refugees into groups geographically across the layout of our camp. We organized the refugees into community groups, and the groups were led by our volunteer uniformed Air Force people. That group was called the Relocation Office, RLO. So these RLO people stayed at the camp. They didn't live there, but they worked in shifts and were available to their group of refugees 24/7. That's the way we handled any small problems. Any person who came down with a fever and needed to go over to the clinic, we'd help them do that. Any other problems? Obviously, some of the refugees had connections in the United States, and we wanted to try to put them into communication with them. So it was a hand-holding operation, a challenge that we met very well with this group of refugees. I would say that I fully believe that among that group of 1,000 volunteers from the Air Force, most of them went away as I did at the end of that tour of duty, thinking this was a major event in my Air Force career.
There's going to be this reunion next May. How do you feel knowing that they're going to get back together and this has made such an impact? You have helped make such an impact on all these folks' lives.
I certainly have strong feelings about what's going to happen at the reunion at Eglin, but my feelings spread out, of course, much broader than that. So anyone who's a Vietnamese refugee living here in the U.S. today, I speak to you from the heart, giving you my admiration for the way you have adjusted to your new life here in America, and you've done so well. You know that across our country, over the 50 years that you've been here, there have been great successes, a few failures in business and school, but many great successes, and you have continued to contribute to the American community in fantastic ways. So my compliments to you. I'm so happy to still be among you. Thank you very much.